films. And okay, unfortunately, we have got only 2 presentations because Lydia Kuznetsova won't be able to join us today. So therefore, I'm going to introduce the second speaker in the program to you, which is Raymond de Luca. He's a PhD student in Slavic languages and literatures at Harvard University with a secondary field in film and visual studies. He's currently writing a dissertation on the relationship between consumerism and film going in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. But his research interests and publications are much broader and focus on post-war Soviet cinema, cinematic space, animals in film, and cinema's relation to the body. So it's obviously one of your interests, animals and cinema, and I would say the floor is yours.
Thank you. And actually, it's funny to have read that description because you realize how much has changed in the year of the pandemic. And so the dissertation has actually changed to be pretty much just about animals in Soviet cinema. And I have a chapter, which is this presentation spins out of, on animals in Muratova. So that is one of the many things that have changed this year is what I'm in fact working on. Because I realized that thinking about animals is an incredibly complicated thing in the history of cinema, particularly in Soviet cinema. I guess today what I'm going to chat about is this idea of becoming animal, which comes out of Deleuze and Guattari's work, which I'll talk a little bit about, and sort of a fluid notion of identity, kind of the decentering of kind of anthropocentric perception and the mind. And these clips or these screenshots are from Muratova's film Enthusiasms, which we'll hear more about in just a minute, and her notion of horsehood. But I think this is a really great sort of visual document to start with in thinking about animals, this idea of fusion between humans and animals in her work. And as we all know, as probably familiar, right, is that this one in the bottom corner is a picture of the filmmaker herself as kind of this horse-like figure, so sort of inscribing film into the project of destabilizing the human. So I want to begin where many of us seem to begin, and that's in the beginning of Muratova with Korotkие встречи. And as has been noted in much of the scholarship and also by some of the presenters here, is how in this film, Muratova subverts the shot, reverse shot strategy of classical narrative cinema. Lilia Kaganovsky, in her great work on this film, talks about how Muratova here sort of decenters the male subject, and Lydia Kadyrova talks about, sort of extends that and talks about how Muratova not only descends the male subject, but also for a focus on sort of non-human objects and presences. And she has a beautiful phrase, the obdurate materiality of Muratova's films. So in this presentation today, I kind of want to extend this work, but looking beyond the male figures of her cinema, looking even beyond the objects with a focus explicitly on animals, right? And sort of the destabilizing of the non-human anthropocentric gaze. So I want to begin with just, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with this, but just summing up a little bit some of the points of Deleuze and Guattari, this very complex, fluid idea of becoming animal. The assumption undergirding the evolutionary pyramid, they say, can be mapped arborescently, right? That's like a tree, contiguously in order of significance, linearly, vertically, sturdily. Yet to systematize life into coherent categories and hierarchies along a tree for Deleuze and Guattari, in fact, denies the complexities of species experience and existence. They write, "We're tired of trees. Thought is not arborescent, and the brain is not rooted or ramified matter." They reject the notion that evolution is a signaling process of organisms developing into more and more perfect beings. They emphasize the involution of all things who exist in symbiotic, unpredictable relationships with one another. And so every animal in this light is a messy multiplicity, an assemblage with qualitative traits, but not quantitative states. The philosophy is not about animal imitation, which is sometimes said, but about opening oneself up to the possibility of unmaking and remaking human-animal divides. An animal becoming is an experience of freedom in some ways. And so circling back to Muratova, and this is a famous quote, I know that Jane Taubman cites it in her work on Muratova. Muratova says in an interview, a plethora of complementary things marvelously coexist in the universe. The world is large and I like its variety. It resembles a zoo. There is one single kind of animal, one that could be the correct animal. It's that way with people, with things, with the whole of everything. And so this is, right, a Deleuzian proclamation, if there ever was one. Moments of border crossings, unknowability, and transgressive play are on display in her work as early as Brief Encounters. And this is sort of the preeminent animal moment in this debut film, right, when we're positioned from the perspective of boiling prawns. So I think this is a hint of what comes out in her later cinema of generating alternative perceptual and embodied modes of species encounters, where the spectator sort of assumes the position momentarily of an animal that's killed alive. And I think this is a way that we can expand sort of the subjective possibilities beyond the human. And so there are three main ways I think Muratova aligns with Deleuze and Guattari's work. And the first one is what I call a zoomorphic gaze, right? So this instance comes, it's a 5-minute sequence from Muratova's film Enthusiasms, which again, we'll hear more about in a moment. But a wandering camera in this scene scans the bodies of several horses as they head out of a barn, jumping from one snout to another's hooves to others' nostrils. And the soundtrack, I've muted it here, but the soundtrack, if we were to hear it, is filled by horse trots, the din of a crowd, and animal noises, brays, neighs, and grunts. It's a bewildering non-narrative sequence that destabilizes the normative viewing position of mainstream cinema. And we're momentarily seeing from within this world rather than looking at it, right? The camera embeds our gaze in a very disorientingly way that we're surrounded by bodies and horses. And these fragmented images of limbs and hides and hooves and noises kind of sensualize the screen, right? They engender an elastic gaze that's more inclined to look and to scan than it is to focus. These equine surfaces invite us to discern texture rather than form, figures without figuration. The camera even assumes, right, the droopy, fitful point of view of a horse led by the reins, as if we're watching this from the horse's gaze. And so this zoomorphic gaze comes out of another iconic sequence of Muratova's work, where the Symposium gets its title from Asthenic Syndrome. In this instance, when a group of women enter a canine shelter, a wandering camera recreates a dog's meandering gaze as it irregularly zooms in and zooms out of canine bodies. And we also notice the intense lateral presence of the iron bars, almost prison-like bars here, that really foregrounds in our vision what is foregrounded in the canine vision, right? The obdurate presence of the cell. And Muratova lingers in this space for 5 minutes, kind of recreating the carceral nature of the pound for her spectators. We end up feeling the scene haptically and ethically. And dogs rely on a sensory regime in which opticality is far less central than it is for humans, experiencing the world through heightened sensations of touch and smell and sound. And so this sequence, I think, edges our perception a little bit closer to a dog's-like experience of the pound. And the grainy footage, almost sepia-like, right, enacts a dog's poor eyesight, which they see primarily in black and white and browns. And I think it's interesting and something that hasn't been theorized fully yet, but the elegiac piano music complemented by the subtitle obviously takes us back to silent cinema. And I thought about for a long time, what is the connection Muratova might be making between sort of the silence of her canines and the silence of motion pictures, right? Is it reminding us of a time when films couldn't speak for themselves the way animals can't? And this cinematic silencing creates empathy with the dogs, or a potential empathy with the dogs. It deprives us of the language that we otherwise use to explain away our inhumane treatment of animals. And if the sound was on in this space, in this clip, we could hear that the dogs are howling and yelping and whimpering. And it makes clear that while dogs don't have access to human speech, they do have some kind of oral communication. We can't understand it, but we do recognize it as a response to their harsh treatment. And so Muratova embeds our perception visually and orally in the space of the pound. And so the zoomorphic gaze, just to wrap up this first part, is a sonic visual one that privileges the texture of experience over its intelligibility, haptics over optics, sensations over interpretations. The second way I think Muratova aligns with Deleuze and Guattari's theory of becoming animal is her fascination with packs and swarms and group formations. So Deleuze and Guattari theorize at length this idea of the swarm and the amorphous, restless structure of an animal herd that wordlessly operates with all its elements in sync. But it's, there's a kind of symmetry to it, but also this sort of radical instability where form is constantly churning and reforming itself. And so the herd is an event of emergence in which individual bodies fleetingly and messily become something else before again becoming something else. And I think the starkest example of a herd in Muratova's cinema, something that had also been mentioned yesterday, is the scene from the Moscow metro in Asthenic Syndrome. We're taken into a journey into the hyper congested underworld, which has been compared to Dante's Inferno. And the camera shifts between high angle shots of the torrent of people streaming into the station, but also, as here on the elevator, embeds our gaze within the crowd. And so flitting past the camera, no person remains in the frame long enough to be individualized. Muratova dwells on an undifferentiated mass of bodies wordlessly and amorphously churning through space. We could read this almost as an animal swarm, right? A multiplicity of same species organisms in tumultuous group formations. And the characters themselves navigate the world by kind of this instinct or intuition, right? Is that they're suffering from asthenia. They're yawning, they're sleeping, they're sort of going through the motions in an almost animal-like way of getting from point A to point B. And also bodies, right, as we see in these stills of Nikolai, are pushed, shoved, trampled on, walked over, is that this is kind of an animal stampede in which the fallen are not retrieved. So this fascination with chaotic group formations is about emergence in which fixed identities and relations unravel amidst destabilizing intensity. And so the interest Muratova has in pack animals, the way individuals are deformed by the experience of herding, I think is this pivot away from cinema as a tool that can individualize subjects, right? And a main way that cinema does this is through close-ups and the face. And so this is where the third way I think Muratova aligns with Deleuze and Guattari comes in, is this undoing or this remaking of the face. And so Deleuze and Guattari argue that without face, the body becomes animal because it loses its definitional structure, thus revealing how all creatures are nothing but flesh and bone. And Deleuze and Guattari continue to suggest that the human face has historically been exploited to prescribe, to deface and to efface the rights and considerations of others. One's visage, right, is a ticket into a narrow corridor of whiteness and westernness and patriarchy, whose gatekeepers have taxonomized humankind by declining degrees of faciality. So imagine instead, they urge, a world without faces. I think in much of her cinema, Muratova sort of takes up this mantle and sort of destabilizes the face and reimagines alternative configurations of what constitutes humanness and belonging. And the face is a regime of socialization that for Muratova might be escaped for new forms of inclusivity. And so I want to briefly dwell on one of my favorite, probably my favorite Muratova's film, The Sensitive Policeman, which is this orphan tale about a police officer. And in this one sequence, kind of halfway through the film, these two characters, Clava and Tolia, are found at the zoo, and she's sort of pruning his hands and body like a chimpanzee might. She's outlining his face, right? So calling attention to the architecture of human visages, just as the way that Valentina did to Maxime in Brief Encounters. And then when he wakes up, he yawns, which rhymes with this lion in the bars, also yawning, and he is aside his own lioness companion. So this interspecies facial and bodily mix-up, I think Muratova uses to blur the corporeal distinctions between humans and animals. And I think this is an incredibly egalitarian film that was released at a time of profound cultural and social dislocation. Its playfulness and its lightheartedness, and I think its inclusivity, sort of pushes back against the context in which it enters. And the film's playfulness, of course, right, and this has been pointed out by many people who have worked on this film, but it's perfectly captured in this punning trick shot that renames an orphanage, Dom Rebionka, to a house of fucking, Dom Jebionka. And I think here, Muratova sort of lays bare the animal nature of human procreation that is otherwise couched in the language of romance or courtship, the carnality of what it means to bring life into this world is what is interesting to Muratova. And also the sensitive policeman also humanizes a maligned figure of state power, especially in the early 90s, the police officer, the militsioner, and it recalls Dmitry Prigov's conceptual poetry, and he often playfully thematized police officers as his persona. And so Muratova herself described this film as a democratic film, and I think its democraticness lies in its treatment of animals. So in the very beginning of this film, Tolia is found in a cabbage patch dismantling and reassembling a plastic baby doll. And like the doll itself, Tolia, as we see in that one still of just his arm, is also kind of dismembered almost. And this focus on body parts, I think, is thrown into really sharp relief in this moment of Tolia and Clava when they wake up and go through their morning routine completely naked. And the viewer is given unimpeded access into an intimate domestic space, the same way Tolia and Clava are given access into the private domains of zoo animals. The two humans here become targets for a zoological gaze, exposed creaturely bodies, subjected to kind of our voyeuristic curiosity. And the rectangular movie screen, one might even say, reenacts the shape of cages enclosing the film's elephants and lions. And there's a famous genre in early cinema of zoo films, right? So Muratova here might be suggesting that to spectate people on screen is analogous to spectating zoo animals in cages. The zoo mobilizes kind of a different framing device. And so intermixing the faces and bodies and experiences of peoples and animals, the sensitive policeman advocates for a far-reaching kind of identification with the non-human that effaces the human's place at the top of the evolutionary pyramid. It urges viewers to be sensitive to their own animality at a time when the post-Soviet world was dramatically reconstituting its own boundaries of belonging. And so an orphan tale, right, The Sensitive Policeman, is a story about potential and potentially limitless inclusivity. And this film, I think, recalls other episodes in Muratova cinema of where the organization of the face is destabilized and eluded. And so these continual close-ups of snarling animals, of taxidermied animals, of people snarling, of other people in face masks. I think these images are asking who gets to have face, right? And if we think of Levinas and sort of his ethics of face-to-face relations, as that's where our ethical consideration and moral responsibility to the other emerges, he's still operating in a fairly tight anthropocentric framework, talking about human-to-human facial relations. I think Muratova expands those parameters. And in Russian, right, if we think of this as litsom k litsu, I think Muratova might be advocating for a kind of mordy k mordye, right? Not a face-to-face ethics, but a mug-to-mug ethics, right? Including the animal face as a way to think about who has face and who gets ethical consideration. So, and now I want to briefly conclude by suggesting that while Muratova does enact several major important aspects of Deleuze and Guattari's theory of becoming animal, I think she also incorporates a pushback to their very ideas. So most of the animals Muratova spotlights, as Nancy Condi points out in her great work, Muratova's Zoological Imperium, are encountered in spaces marked by abusive exertions of human power. Pounds, racetracks, hippodromes, circuses, zoos, farms. These are all sites where animals are spectated, incarcerated, and manufactured. And so a committed, if imperfect, vegetarian who denounced the animal violence aestheticized by her contemporary Andrei Tarkovsky, Muratova was always sensitive to the determinative role humans play in animal lives. And this recognition of lived animal experience, I think, disassociates her from Deleuze and Guattari. The philosophers fail to expand in detail on actual animal lives. An animal, for Deleuze and Guattari, functions more as a concept, an abstract concept, than as a living being whose conditions might be of concern for us. So lost in Deleuze and Guattari's race to dismantle the human is a consideration of the widespread mistreatment of animals or the institutions that oppress them. Their breathless critique of anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism ironically leaves actual animals behind, thus raising questions about who or what their animal theory is written for. So though Muratova deploys visual strategies to transform and fragment the anthropocentric mind, she does not elide the hierarchical power structures in which animals are always embedded. Muratova's animal becomings we might think of them as being ambivalent. They distort the anthropocentric gaze for a more creaturely experience of the world, but these becomings are themselves distorted by the realities of human power. And so we might think of Muratova's definition of an animal from a human, not in ontological terms, but in relational terms. Humans are different from animals in the degree to which they can exert pressure on other living beings that animals cannot. And that is the end. And this clip from Minor People of a man. I describe this as a man French kissing a monkey, but someone corrected me to refer to this as an episode of simian kissing, which I think is very appropriate. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for this very, very interesting talk and for the even funny examples of her films. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dragan Batančev. He's a PhD student in film and moving image studies at Concordia University in Montreal in Canada. And he is also a research affiliate at the Concordia-based Global Emergent Media Lab. If it's that, I hope it's still true,
yes,
because
yes.
I have, okay. Dragan Batančev is also writing a dissertation, and his topic is transnational Eastern European cinematic exchange. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And what I found particularly interesting, Dragan is also a scriptwriter of a number of short films, documentaries, and TV series, as I understood, for Serbian TV.
Yeah, Serbian national television.
Okay. So thanks a lot, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, for that introduction. Well, hello, everyone from Canada in a different time zone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the symposium. It is really a great pleasure to share views and contribute to an ever-growing body of knowledge about one of the most idiosyncratic filmmakers in the history of cinema. I would also like to thank Professor Jampolsky for sending me his book about Muratova's Over. And I also wanted to say that it is really a great pleasure to be on this panel with Raymond, and I'm looking forward to possibly exchanging our research drafts and thus enriching our writing. I'm also looking forward to hearing Lydia Kuznetsova's presentation later on. This month or next month. The concept of horsehood in my presentation's title about the film Uvlečenja, Henceforth Passions, is a nod to Muratova's statement in Jane Taubman's book. Quote, "There is the concept of humanity, but not of dogdom, cathood, or birdkind, which are much closer to me and to whom I feel much more responsible." End quote. What follows are preliminary research notes. so I welcome any and all feedback. Due to obvious temporal limitations, I focused on a few aspects of my conference proposal. In a curious interview given to a Russian equine magazine, Konny Mir, or Horse World, in 2002, Renata Litvinova talked about horse riding as her hobby and an important aspect of her first collaboration with Muratova. Litvinova describes the character she played in the film, Lily, as an alien whose very name points to her hybrid nature as an underwater and terrestrial flower. The actress recalls the shooting at the dilapidated Piatigorsk Hippodrome, which constituted a metaphysical labyrinth, along with the hospital, the circus, and the seacoast in the film. Litvinova recounts Muratova's decision to overlay shots of galloping horses with Litvinova and Svetlana Kolenda's lovemaking sounds. Litvinova's trademark vamp appearance was then comically juxtaposed to the horse stables full of flies irritated by her heavy makeup. At some point, Lily, the character that she played, invites the jockeys to work as sanitarians, noting that the only unpleasant job requirement is taking out the buckets with surgically removed human organs. Referencing Muratova's dichotomy of virtually mechanized, doll-like human characters, and then on the other hand, lively cinematic horses, Litvinova's interviewer quotes Boris Paramonov, who suggested that the entire film rests on the contrast between ugly people and beautiful horses. Quote by Paramonov, "Man is a bucket of organs, while horses are useful even in death. The latter notion undoubtedly inspired by Tolstoy's Holstomer. Man and horse are united only in the pictures of a madman who allegedly photographed a centaur in the Ascania Nova Nature Reserve," that Raymond showed in his presentation. At the beginning of the film, the characters jokingly ride each other accompanied by Ode to Joy. The film ends with a horse parade followed by more Beethoven. End quote. Litvinova recounted how Muratova edited the horse's ballet-style movements with her character's monologue about the incomprehensible self-destruction of supreme beauty. The second part of Litvinova's interview, which I won't analyze on this occasion, still begs the question about horse riding as a snobbish, bourgeois hobby for Muratova's characters and Litvinova alike. In the following section, I want to talk about how Passions pays tribute, even if indirectly, to the well-known history of the relationship between horse riding, photography, and moving images, encapsulated in the pioneering work of Edward Muybridge, who lived from 1830 to 1904. Famously, Muybridge was hired by Leland Stanford, the robber baron and founder of Stanford University, to prove the unsupported motion controversy, the theory that during a horse's stride, there was a moment when all four of its legs left the ground. In 1877, Muybridge captured Stanford's horse Occident, what a pretentious name for a horse, with all 4 feet off the ground. A year later, Muybridge used multiple cameras to photograph a galloping mare at Stanford's farm in California. Muybridge's series of photographs introduced a new media format, chronophotography, which demonstrated the scientific value of photography in studies of locomotion. Next came experimentation with moving images. In 1880, Muybridge used his device, zoopraxiscope, to project onto a wall a series of painted silhouettes, each reproducing a single phase of motion captured by his cameras, rapidly enough to reconstitute an entire movement. Muybridge's zoopraxiscope inspired Thomas Edison to create the kinetoscope, and as such became an important milestone in the creation of cinema. I see Muratova's indirect reference to Muybridge's horse-themed chronophotography in the photo finish shot examined by Yampolsky as the meaning-making moment, precisely because the photograph shows the horse's movement as indiscernible in the cinematic continuum. In other words, what we can see on the photo, we cannot see in cinema or with the naked eye. While Muybridge developed chronophotography as a technology for enabling his rich patron to prove a phenomenon escaping the naked eye, Muratova used cinema to show that people cannot actually see equine beauty. And in this sense, echoes some of the things that Raymond said in his presentation about that long sequence of horses walking. Muratova and numerous authors labeled Passions as a light comedy, but I argue that its quasi-pastoral quality is ironic. After all, this is her first film in the post-socialist era, showing that her ontological dilemma about what constitutes humanity was unresolved despite the proclaimed end of history in the 1990s. If the sentimental policeman completed the deconstruction of Soviet ideology begun in the Aesthetic Syndrome, and then 3 stories bookended the transitional nightmare, then Passions showed disillusionment with the cutthroat mentality of the post-Soviet nouveau riche, interested only in an ever-increasing number of victories and material gains. These victories are won at the expense of both exhausted horses and the dying working class, which at best can only afford to bet on the horses owned by the rich, but cannot own them. Thus, the historical circle connecting Leland Stanford and post-Soviet robber barons is closed. Speaking of the affluent, multiple authors writing about Muratova's cinema, as well as Muratova herself, have identified the influence of Leo Tolstoy's literature on her films. As such, I would like to talk briefly about Francisco Larrubia Prado's analysis of Tolstoy's classic story, Hostomier. In his book, the title of the book is The Horse in Literature and Film, as a stepping stone for thinking about Muratova's conceptualization of horsehood. Let me first remind you that Hostomier is a story narrated by a horse exposing strange human behavior while changing masters. Larrubia Prado suggests that the horse represents a link to the Christian God and natural morality, abandoned by corrupted humankind. Furthermore, similar to Friedrich Nietzsche, Tolstoy's, and this is Larrubia Prado's extended quote, Hostomier, acting like a philologist, unmasks some of the linguistic traps that underlie the formation of truth and the functioning of human society. When people stop listening to the voice of nature, acts and speech become dissociated. As a result, human life turns into a performance in which the script is not one's own, but is written by others, and in which people wear the masks that society forces them to wear. Hostomier notices this and points out, the horse, the protagonist of the story notices this, and points out that human beings are strange creatures who mainly talk, whereas horses as natural beings live a much more wholesome existence, dominated not by what one says and what others think of you, but by what one is. The split between words and deeds that Hostomier points out is placed by Yuri Lotman in a broader cultural context when he notes that the emphasis on the importance of deeds versus words reflects the mentality of the Enlightenment, and by extension shows Jean-Jacques Rousseau's influence over Tolstoy. According to Lotman, the organization of Enlightenment culture was based on the opposition between natural and non-natural, and the opposition to signs. The world of things is real, while the world of signs and of social relations is brought by a false civilization. End quote. Larrubia Prado further stresses Tolstoy's interest in Rousseau's writings about the necessity of man's return to nature. Consider, for example, the following contemplation of Rousseau's as echoing some of Muratova's obsessions. Quote, God makes all things good. Man meddles with them and they become evil. He forces one soil to yield the products of another, one tree to bear another's fruit. He confuses and confounds time, place, and natural conditions. He mutilates his dog, his horse, and his slave. He destroys and defaces all things. He loves all that is deformed and monstrous. He will have nothing as nature made it, not even man himself, who must learn his paces like a saddle horse. and be shaped to his master's taste like the trees in his garden, end quote. Of course, any deeper comparison of Rousseau's thought and Muratova's cinema would have to take into account Muratova's self-professed atheism, but I think that there is more than enough food for thought to chew on in that comparison. Larrubia Prado further singles out another issue interesting to Rousseau, Tolstoy, and Muratova alike: the violence inscribed in property. He writes, Rousseau traces a strong connection among the institution of property, worldly ambition, the end of compassion towards others, deception in pursuit of profit, and enforced dependency of some people upon others. According to Rousseau, all these evils were the first effects of property and the inseparable attendants of growing inequality. Along similar lines, Nancy Conde reminds us of Muratova's enduring skepticism towards an imaginary of belonging, not only in terms of belonging to a human collective, but also in the sense of humans possessing animals as property and thinking about animals, that animals belong to them. A case in point is the scene in Passions in which the photographer wants to take a photo of the horse rather than the self-imposing lily, saying photography is a form of possession. Jan Polsky argues that photography appropriates the object of representation, endowing it with beauty precisely in terms of possession, and imposed aesthetic meaning. Possession inevitably leads to abuse. According to Conde, animals are not exalted substitutes for Homo sapiens, but exist on a continuum with human life, enduring similar torments in similar disciplining environments, something that Raymond also mentioned. And if Muratova's humans torment animals more than the reverse, this fact is less a moral difference than a taxonomic distinction, a testimony to the human's more developed fine motor skills and greater dexterity for tormenting, end quote. Recall then the scene in which the circus tamer in Passions exclaims profanation upon getting a chain of dogs to walk on their back legs, only to conclude the dogs are prose while horses are poetry. In other words, the act of propelling dogs on their back legs is constitutive of what Conde calls the pan-mammalian menagerie in Muratova's films. When Muratova's animals draw an empathetic contrast to humans, it is not inherent goodness that marks them, but a reassuring, if incidental, absence of human reason, Conde asserts. Last but not least, a few words about the centaurs. Conde argues that the photographer who shot the centaurs in Ascania Nova stands in for Muratova and her fascination, again, something that Raymond mentioned in his presentation, with becoming an animal. So this is Muratova's filmmaking obsession with becoming an animal, thereby subverting humanist aspirations to a higher purpose and shaping Muratova's counter-Darwinism, an evolution of the sickest. The school, the street, the family home, and the psychiatric hospital are linked in a visual continuum as common sites for an ongoing discharge of aggression, end quote. Muratova's circus arena and horse race track are also notable as their enclosed circular shape implies the impossibility of horses ever leaving these disciplinary spaces. In this context, it is interesting to hear what Larrubia Prado has to say about Tolstoy's Hostomier and centaurs. Quote, on one hand, Hostomier progressively becomes aware and critical of how human society works, even if he remains unable to seek recourse to the human capabilities of free will or the perfectibility of his faculties. Hostomier's double ontology reflects two kinds of poetics. When he's described as simply a horse, he belongs to the world of realism or to that which is in agreement with natural law. However, the Hostomier who possesses consciousness, memory, and language, and who becomes the narrator of his own story, ultimately an artist, belongs to what in Aristotle's poetics is part of the possible. Just as for Aristotle the centaur is possible, so the horse with human consciousness falls within the realm of the possible within an Aristotelian poetics. In this respect, the realist Hostomier, i.e. the one who is just a horse, functions as the voice of nature and as such as the uncorrupted source of morality, and Tolstoy derives morality from nature, while the Hostomer with human faculties makes a critique of society possible and aesthetic appreciation viable by remembering experiences, selecting information, and communicating his feelings, end quote. In contrast to Tolstoy's horse, Muratova's animals do not talk. They do not narrativize the world around them. Obviously, Muratova was not a proponent of the Disney-style anthropomorphization of animals. Along these lines, Jampolsky rather convincingly analyzes the jockey's monologue in Muratova's film. The jockey explains that the horse understands only the correlation between the jockey's whipping and the movement she needs to make. From this, Jampolsky extrapolates Muratova's insistence on the equine indifference to the human obsession with competition, or culture for that matter. The horse's absolute authenticity cannot be grasped by any human representation of the horse. Simultaneously, abandoning cruelty towards animals is Muratova's ultimate measure of humanity. The cruelty towards animals is inextricable from the cruelty embedded in culture. Jampolsky concludes, Muratova's animal is above all a litmus indicating the sickness of the humankind and pathology of culture, end quote. By way of final provocation, I'm wondering if Jampolsky's point about Muratova's negative attitude towards culture, human culture, and Condi's similarly framed thought about the absence of reason in animals could nevertheless be productively challenged. Put differently, can Muratova's animals speak to us in a way even remotely resembling that of Tolstoy's Hostomer? Can we learn something from animals, or is that cause long lost? Jampolsky demonstrates the degree to which humanity is shaped by animality, and I think that's one of the leitmotifs of his book. But is there a way to move beyond Condi's and Jampolsky's doubtlessly useful notions of zoological imperium and opit kinoanthropology to think about Muratova's cinema as possibly a zoological republic and opit kinozoology? Thank you very much.